I am working on my screen share now. Are you seeing?
We can see it, yes.
Okay.
Do you want to put it into presentation mode?
Yes, I do.
Okay. That looks good.
You seeing it in the correct mode now?
Yep, looks great.
Great. Well, thanks
Hey,
so
Katie, before you start, let me just do one quick little check-in with our friends out on Zoom. Having just had our first presentation of the day, I want to make sure that everything's working well on your end. So if you had any issues with audio or not being able to see things the way you should, please let us know. If everything's working great, put a little thumb up emoji or a little smiley face emoji or an all good in the chat, just so we know how we're addressing your needs.
All good remotely, thanks.
All right, now back to our regularly scheduled program. Katie, you're on.
Great, thanks so much, and thanks for the invitation to be here today. Yeah, so I'm the U.S. Forest Service Liaison to the Chesapeake Bay Program. So I work at the Bay Program office and the big partnership office there in Annapolis, across the Chesapeake Bay Watershed states. So I'm going to be talking today about some of the findings and recommendations that emerged from a Science and Technical Advisory Committee, or STAC, workshop that was held last year, or sorry, 2 years ago, and then the report just came out earlier this year. So the workshop itself brought together over 100 scientists, subject matter experts over 2 days. I think a lot of you were actually involved in that workshop, so thanks for your assistance with the workshop itself. And we were trying to address a whole series of objectives. So, you know, we're trying to look at the drivers of rising water temperature, identify some of the ecological impacts, develop management and policy recommendations, and identify research, monitoring, or analyses needed to support the recommendations. So a little background and justification. It's probably not a surprise to most of you here, but you know, over the last several decades, water temperatures have been warming, both in the bay itself, as well as in all the non-tidal streams and rivers. So that really led to an increasing recognition within the Bay Program partnership that, you know, rising water temperature is really going to impact our ability to meet not only our water quality goals, but also a lot of our living resource goals for things like brook trout. And so really, we need to be thinking about water temperature as kind of a foundational parameter for meeting our goals as a partnership. But we need to, of course, recognize that the temperatures, or the mechanisms that are driving warming water temperatures really vary pretty significantly between tidal and non-tidal waters. Tidal waters, temperatures are really driven more by kind of atmospheric forcings and the warming ocean boundary and kind of global forces that we're not very likely to be able to mitigate through some of our watershed restoration strategies. But non-tidal waters, the story is much more complex. So, you know, there's multiple factors influencing water temperature beyond just kind of warming air temperatures, including, you know, whether there are groundwater inputs and land use, the relative amount of impervious surfaces and forests, in particular riparian forests, as you all know, have a big influence on water temperatures, as that tree canopy is directly shading and cooling streams. So, you know, given those differences between the drivers of rising water temperature, we split the whole workshop effort really into two subgroups. The watershed group, or the non-tidal subgroup, really looked at opportunities to moderate rising water temperatures. So things we can do on the land, either to directly cool water temperatures or just to minimize the extent to which heated runoff is entering waterways. Adaptation approaches were more the focus on the tidal side, you know, thinking about restoration or management activities that can help minimize impacts on particular species or habitats. And we did look at that a little bit on the watershed side as well, especially in the context of cold water species like brook trout. But I'm really just going to focus on the non-tidal recommendations today. Just, you know, if you are interested in the tidal ones, there's a whole another set of recommendations that emerged on the tidal side as well. So I encourage you to check out the full report if you're interested in those. Just starting with some of the ecological impacts that we kind of highlighted, to better understand how we're going to respond management. We got to understand what impacts we're dealing with. So in streams and the non-tidal waters, obviously we expect the strongest negative impact for those cold water species like brook trout and checkered sculpin that are more sensitive to warm water. And of course, these species receive a lot of attention. But warm water species also were a topic of discussion, that can be, and these species might not be kind of as immediately sensitive to small increases in rising water temperatures, but, when we're getting extreme temperature increases, kind of those aquatic heat wave events, and when you layer on some of the indirect effects related to multiple stressors, especially in urban streams, sorry about that. These are going crazy. All right. So when you layer on some of those other indirect effects, things like increasing algal growth with warmer water temperatures, mobilization of other pollutants like heavy metals and kind of invasive species impacts as kind of the aquatic community is changing, there can still be some pretty negative impacts on those warm water species as well. And then also talked about, the lower parts of the food web and just needing more research on, impacts of rising water temperatures on algae and macroinvertebrates and freshwater mussels and their host species. So to dive into some of our recommendations that emerged, I'm dividing these up basically into what we can do to moderate rising water temperatures and what we can do to adapt to rising water temperatures. So on the moderation side, forest conservation, forest buffers, tree planting are already some of the best tools that we have in our toolbox for getting to some of our Bay Program goals for 2025. But these are also the outcomes where we're falling pretty far behind. For forest conservation, we saw with our new high resolution land use change data set that we've lost over 100,000 acres of tree cover just to development between 2013 and 2018 across the watershed. So especially in areas where we have good trout streams and cold water habitats, rising water temperatures just really reinforces the need to work towards our existing forest conservation and brook trout goals and really put more focus on conserving the forest land that we still have. In places that need restoration, the partnership needs to help prioritize BMPs that can help cool or moderate rising water temperatures, especially riparian forest buffers, which have already been identified as a key priority outcome by the partnership. But also looking at practices like tree planting and urban water infiltration BMPs. Unfortunately, some of the best management practices that we have that are really effective for water quality are known to warm surface water temperatures, wet ponds, tension ponds, farm ponds. So, there can be some unintended consequences from these water quality practices for water temperatures. And we did kind of a back of the napkin sort of analysis where we just looked at the use of the implementation of what we call heater BMPs versus cooler BMPs over time, based on what's been reported to the Bay Program for the TMDL reporting. And over time, we saw that the use of heaters has greatly exceeded the use of coolers in the watershed. So, we need to think about how we can prioritize implementation of these coolers, especially in our cold water habitat areas where we have vulnerable species, but also in some of our historically underserved urban communities that have generally experienced worse heating and human health outcomes. The Bay Program and our partners can also leverage our existing work with local governments to support good land use planning and minimize impervious surfaces in favor of practices that will help allow for infiltration and kind of minimize the extent to which that kind of superheated urban runoff is entering waterways. then for water quality standards, the states and the EPA can work together and use some of our temperature-related fisheries research to update the water quality standards mechanisms that we have for rivers and streams related to temperature, and make them more protective for the more pervasive warming that we're seeing now, as opposed to their kind of current use, which is more focused on kind of point source impacts, point source thermal impacts. So the report recommends completing an evaluation of TMDL options to spur restoration of temperature impaired water uses and identify what opportunities there are to leverage our anti-degradation policies to increase protection of current high quality waters. And Maryland's, they've been working on developing a temperature TMDL. So we kind of really dove into what they've been doing and using that as an example as kind of a promising policy approach for addressing rising water temperatures. So on the adaptation side, we can use restoration both within streams and alongside streams to help with aquatic organism passage, so they can access some of those cooler parts of the streams. And be able to access those thermal refugia that are, more likely to stay cool, both as waterways are warming gradually with the climate, but also during those extreme aquatic heat wave events that can be particularly detrimental for all the critters living in the streams. There also might be opportunities for us to kind of more intentionally create these refugia through our restoration practices. So there's a recommendation that we should kind of support efforts to provide kind of design recommendations for how we can better incorporate thermal refugia into our stream restoration protocols and site designs. So on the science side, we have a number of recommendations around kind of the science needed to support effective management responses. So first, we should build on our understanding of BMPs that we already know are going to help with climate resiliency, like forest buffers, tree canopy, wetlands, to better integrate water temperature considerations and their impacts into our evaluation of BMPs. We have a whole expert panel process that we could consider kind of broadening out to evaluate temperature impacts of BMPs, just like we do with nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment. Or we could have kind of a separate process. But beyond kind of that additional research to help us select the best practices for addressing rising water temperatures, additional science could help us focus our restoration efforts. We have a number of great tools at the Bay Program and some really rich data to build from, and I was excited to hear about the efforts Drought Unlimited is doing. I think that's going to be super helpful. But there are better opportunities to kind of integrate all of these different data sets. We have our land use data, our hydrologic modeling, we're getting better ecological data. So layering all those together to figure out where we really need to be focusing our conservation and restoration efforts to the places that are going to have the greatest benefit for kind of reducing overall vulnerability. There are also opportunities to improve our water temperature monitoring and modeling, in particular, focusing more attention on smaller streams, which tend to be important cold water habitat areas. And include more frequent monitoring and more integrated monitoring approaches, so we can, better understand not only the temperature trends, but also how they're impacting aquatic biota. So taking a step back and, thinking about what we're trying to communicate to some of our Bay Program partners and leaders about implications of this report and our recommendations. The Bay Program's most recent 2014 watershed agreement and the TMDL set pretty specific goals for 2025, which is rapidly approaching. So we're starting to think about, what we want to recommend for the next phase of the Bay Program and how some of the findings from this report can help influence those recommendations. So one is just that, as warming water temperatures are going to make it more difficult to reach our goals, both for water quality and for the watershed agreement. So we really need to be putting even more emphasis on riparian forest buffers and forest conservation to help mitigate and adapt to rising water temperatures. And as we move beyond 2025, we need to think about how we can incorporate water temperatures kind of more explicitly into the goals and the outcomes and the management strategies that we're developing for the partnership. One of the things we're trying to highlight is it's not just for living resources, like this is also for water quality, and by better addressing water temperature, we can kind of do both. So, our overarching recommendations are pretty broad, and we have a lot of kind of implementing actions as well in the report. So just wanted to highlight a few here today that might be of interest for you all as managers and scientists. One is researching the efficacy of other potential cooling mitigation strategies. Things like wetland creation, dam and pond removal, floodplain restoration, beaver analog projects, improved roadside ditch management, just so we can kind of better understand what tools we have in our toolbox to help moderate rising water temperatures as managers. The second is to look at how landscape characteristics and project design mediate some of the temperature impacts of stream restoration practices, and to kind of really zero in on siting and design criteria that could help improve thermal outcomes. There was a lot of debate at the workshop and afterwards about the net effect of stream restoration practices, and an acknowledgement that the thermal impacts are really going to vary depending on the project design and where it's being implemented. I think there's a lot of potential for stream restoration to cool streams or provide some resiliency. If we're restoring stream-fed systems, we can help maintain some of those cold water inputs from groundwater. We can use restoration to create thermal refugia and improve access to suitable habitat and improve connectivity. But I think there are still some significant uncertainties. If we're removing trees to do stream restoration practices, that's going to have some at least short-term impacts with the loss of that canopy cover. So we just think, design and siting could better incorporate temperature considerations and work to incorporate thermal refugia and minimize losses of mature trees, just overall kind of taking a more holistic approach to restoration. And then also, we think there's opportunities to kind of conduct more climate vulnerability assessments to better understand the exposure and sensitivity of multiple species to rising temperatures, and bringing in some of those indirect effects to better understand our overall vulnerability. So with that, I'll just wrap up. We have a couple slides just showing all the people that were involved. This is just with the pre-workshop synthesis papers. There are 10 of them that were developed before we even have workshops. And then of course we had numerous workshop participants and people that contributed in other ways as well. So yeah, it was a really big effort and definitely an all hands on deck sort of project. So I think this QR code still works, but if it doesn't, I can throw the link to access the full workshop report in the chat if you're interested in checking it out. It is very long. We did work with C's to develop a shorter, like 8-page kind of nice, shiny, glossy communications document that's really fantastic as well. And I'll definitely put the link to that in the chat. And if anyone wants hard copies of that, I'm happy to mail them out. We have a whole bunch of them. So with that, I'm happy to take questions or hear other kind of thoughts or reactions to what came out of the workshop.
We have time for a question or two from the room or from out in Zoom. If you have a question based on what Katie just shared with us, let us know. I will mention, by the way, that, and I think we acknowledged this earlier, that the session is being recorded, and we'll make the recording available to you. So if there's some things that you want to follow back to or follow up on, you'll have that opportunity via that recording. Any questions for Katie? Barb, anything from our online community?
We have a comment from James. He says, I've noticed a trend in wetland creation / legacy sediment removal where funders do not want trees in the floodplain and only want native shrubs, etc. I see this at Pennsylvania DEP with 319 grants or projects having to do with mitigation easements. Have you seen this? If so, what's your perspective?
I have seen this. Yeah, I think, okay, so how to be tactful. I think there's a bit of a debate on what the goals of ecological restoration should be. And I think some of those folks in Pennsylvania in particular, that are doing these legacy sediment projects, are really focused on restoring to historic conditions that may or may not be viable anymore given upstream land uses. And there has been extensive debate at the Bay Program about what our goals should be with ecological restoration and whether or not it's viable to restore to some of these historical conditions. Being a forestry person and leading the forestry work group, I'd say, we're on the other side of the fence. We want we want more forested riparian areas. We want more trees in the watershed. We know there are all sorts of habitat benefits, both on land and in the water. So I think, we need to have a broader discussion about, what our goals are as a partnership with regards to ecological restoration. But that's a great question.
All right, thank you very much, Katie. We're going to leave it there for now.